Objects are the symbols. You usually think of them simply as realities. You think of thoughts, images, and dreams sometimes as being symbolic of other things, but the truth is that physical objects are themselves symbols. They are the exterior symbols that stand for inner experience. There are, therefore, mass physical symbols upon which you all agree, as well as private personal symbols. The whole nature and structure of physical life as you know it is a symbolic statement made by groups of entities who choose to work with physical symbolism. You have formed the symbols, and therefore you can change them. You must learn, of course, what the various symbols mean in your own life and how to translate their meaning. To do so, you must first of all remind yourself frequently that the physical condition is symbolic, not a permanent condition. Then you must look within yourself for the inner actuality represented by the symbol. Descriptions of important individuals were changed to ensure their safety, and backgrounds were often fictional for the same reason. These were life and death struggles. Some of the falsified records had poison on the manuscripts, deadly reading material indeed.
In spite of the humor, Seth Jane was very emphatic and serious in giving this material. The pace was fast. Pause at 11 o'clock.
Many of the men involved did lead double lives then, known in their villages by one name and in their brotherhoods by another. In some cases, their more mundane identities were never divulged, but to a few. Later, when the Christians were being persecuted, there were many safeguards taken, particularly by those who believed they had a responsibility to live long enough to see the new creed find fertile ground. Now, the Essenes had deep roots in some of the mystery religions of the Greeks. Some of the Essenes set up schools that were not what they appeared to be. Subterfuge was used. There were various tests applied before an initiate could come close to the interior doctrines.
Pause.
There were other groups of Essenes, therefore, beside the one generally spoken of.
The Essene group generally known would be the Jewish sect in the Holy Land during the time of Christ, early in the 1st century. Historically, they are thought of as a peaceful group.
The Essenes, as they are known, were a surviving group from a larger and more ancient brotherhood. Some existed in Asia Minor. Efforts were made to infiltrate into national or group cultures. Certain basic ideas united the Essenes, therefore, though often they went by different names.
Pause.
There were 3 basic groups. The one generally thought of, an offshoot in Africa, and the Asia Minor group mentioned earlier. Little contact existed between these groups, however, and gradually the inner doctrines themselves showed important variations. The schools often pretended to be giving an education in other areas. The stranger would be kept in this outer group. Some attended such schools without ever knowing of the inner initiates and the more important work being carried on beneath the camouflage. Some of the members of the Zealots were originally Essenes. The Essenes predated them. John the Baptist was an Essene in all important ways, yet a man who steps forward in such a way automatically steps out of his group, and so did your friend, John.
Here Seth humorously referred to my recent interest in John the Baptist. The Zealots were a much more aggressive, semi-political Jewish sect that also existed in the Holy Land early in the 1st century, as I discovered from my recent reading. 946.
There was some jealousy then from certain members of the Essenes at John's progress. At one time, John attempted to join various divergent groups together as one brotherhood, but he failed. The failure weighed heavily upon him. Fire is seldom gentle, and John the Baptist was as filled with fire as Paul. He was a far more gentle man, and yet, in his own way, as fanatical as any of the other main characters of that day. He was much more against what he was against than for what he was for. Christ, you see, was to deliver the message, and John was to prepare the way for it. John had an alliance with a female cousin as a youth. He fled from the knowledge of this for the rest of his life, believing it sinful. Now these were men filled out like sails with the energy of their roles, yet they had to have the personality characteristics of their time. They had to appear as men, before Christ could proclaim himself as anything beyond the natural man. The entanglements were those that were necessary in the context of that religious drama. They were creative in that they bore within them the only seeds that could grow, in your terms, within that place and that time. Now, we do not have to be so formal. Book dictation is over.
Is it?
It is indeed.
Okay.
You may ask me a question or take a break as you prefer.
We'll take the break then. To Sue.
I talk to this one in the dream state often. I do not want to take up all your waking time besides.
9:56 to 10 o'clock.
Now, records were often falsified, completely doctored, and false records were often planted. Religion was politics. It implied sway and power over the masses. It was the business of the rulers to know in which direction the religious winds blew. There were deliberate falsifications of fact then and later. Some sects kept false records on purpose as blinds, so that, if these were stolen, the robbers would think they had what they were after. In some cases, the falsified records have been found, the misrepresentations, while the true records behind them have not as yet been discovered.
Pause.
You had better remember in what session that information was given you.
I don't quite get what you mean.
Before too long, you may have reason to check upon what I have said, for records will appear that seem to contradict previous ones, as indeed they shall, and because of the reasons just given. The Essenes kept sets of records to confuse the Zealots, and another set to confuse the Romans, and they very carefully guarded the inner set from which all the facts were made. They were not as violent as the other groups, but they were as shrewd.
10:06.
There were various marks made, however, to distinguish the various sets of records, true and false.
Jane paused as Seth, a hand to her eyes.
Now, I do not know whether or not we can get this through clearly. Give Rupert a piece of paper, and together we will see.
This session was being held in our living room. Jane sat in her rocker, facing Sue and me on the couch. Our long coffee table separated us. There was a light to Jane's left and one lit beside me. Sue handed Jane a piece of paper and a pen, while I continued to take notes. This was the first time Jane had written anything while in trance. Actually, she was making some small diagrams or symbols, moving the pen quite deliberately, squinting down at the paper. Sue sat just opposite Jane, and I gestured for her to number the symbols when Jane laid the pen down and began to describe them for Seth. About a minute had passed. 2 attempts were made at both the first and last signs.
Now, number 1 is simply a sign of a copy made, a distorted or doctored copy. The middle one was a mark made for a much less distorted copy, and the last mark was for an undoctored record. This looked more like a snake, a serpent.
Speaking emphatically for Seth, Jane pointed at the last symbol as she held the paper up for Sue and me to see. Concerning symbols, in 1947, scholars began acquiring the 7 now famous Dead Sea Scrolls. They had been found in a cave situated above the usually dry Qumran Wadi, or riverbed, which leads to the Dead Sea a mile or so away. Excavations in the Judean desert nearby soon revealed the ruins of a monastery which had been occupied by a divergent Jewish group for varying periods between 180 BC and AD 68. The Qumran settlement was but 15 miles from Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It had been linked with the peaceful Essene sect by some authorities, while others just as strongly associate it with the more aggressive Zealots. Some weeks after this session, Jane and I were interested to read that the St. Mark's Isaiah scroll from the Qumran find contains marginal symbols that had still not been deciphered by the 1960s. This according to the last printing of the reference work we consulted. Some of the symbols, which were illustrated, bear more than a little resemblance to those Seth Jane drew, especially the last one.
It would be nearly impossible for anyone except one of the innermost circle to distinguish between some of the versions presented. These signs would not appear isolated, but in such a fashion that only those who knew how to look for them would find them. They were not blazed in gold on the title page. There were other clues also, certain other signs to be taken in conjunction with these that appeared within the texts.
1017.
Now, in some of these records, the dating, for example, would be just off enough so that only one well-versed would recognize a discrepancy. Some would include an obvious error. Those in the know would immediately recognize that the record was a fake. Some of the distorted records have been taken as fact, and it is a good joke to realize that the Vatican holds some of these. At the time, the Church believed that these records could harm it. In the case of these particular errors, the records instead could have helped the churchmen, but they did not have the sense to know the truth from the false. Now, you may take your break.
A gesture to Sue.
She is not used to my speaking so slowly.
10:20. Sue is used to hearing Seth speak more rapidly in ESP class, where tape recorders are used. I don't record Seth usually, but make direct verbatim notes, using my own kind of shorthand. This saves much time later when I type up the material. Still, Seth often speaks fast enough in our own sessions to keep me writing at top speed. No doubt Seth's amusement at the Vatican holding doctored records stems from his own brief tenure as Pope in one of his lives. Now Seth returned as Sue, and I began to discuss the drawings Jane had done in trance.
Since these are meaningless to Rupert, it is difficult to get the symbolism across to him clearly. They should be drawn much more tightly, for example, not so loosely. In actuality, the signs would appear as tightly concentrated symbols, and thicker in line.
10:24. At break, Jane told us she couldn't draw versions of the symbols based upon those she'd done in trance. I saw them quite clearly, mentally when I was doing them, she said. I don't see anything now, though. Looking at that last drawing, Jane did say that the serpent's tail was supposed to be represented by the lower loop. Resume at 10:45.
Now, give us a moment. In many cases, records were faithfully reproduced, but with the names changed to protect the innocent. Think of the language used presently by governments and diplomats. Think of the difference between what your government knows and what is told to the people. Often, when you hear a denial in such circumstances, you immediately leap to the correct conclusion, that in a month or so an affirmative answer will be given to the same question. Words, therefore, are often used to cover up as well as to reveal. Great efforts are taken so that knowledge is kept often from a majority and for a few. In biblical times, this was all the more true. Literary devices themselves served as formalized methods of seeming to indulge certain information while actually offering instead falsified data. No question in those days was answered directly, not by those who were at all literate. To answer a question directly meant that you were simple-minded and lacked any appreciation of the questioner's greater intelligence, for he seldom asked a question he really wanted answered. It was highly ritualized behavior, understood, however, in those terms. In other words, you do not understand how to translate the material properly from many of those records, even when the translations, per se, are correct. You would call whole pages of the Dead Sea Scrolls tremendous put-ons, since whole pages in literal terms are not true. But these were expected exaggerations and embellishments that preceded the giving of information.
10:55.
All professions, to one extent or another, had such fashions. The records meant life or death if they were discovered at the wrong time. Falsifications were often put in simply to lead any readers astray if the books fell in the wrong hands. Again, those in the know had no worries. They would not be misled. To them the information was clear and the distortions obvious. Now the scrolls are full of such protective distortions. The signs mentioned were but some of the clues used. They appeared in many guises, sometimes intertwined with signatures. These people were much given to codes. Even the arrangement of the letters upon the pages, as you think of pages, had their meanings. The weight or thickness of various strokes had meaning in terms of emphasis. There were even certain ways of handling a preceding word, so that the word would be a clue that the next word was false. Only those in the know would recognize this, of course, and the others would merrily digest the false information. Descriptions of important individuals were changed to ensure their safety, and backgrounds were often fictional for the same reason. These were life and death struggles. Some of the falsified records had poison on the manuscripts, deadly reading material indeed.
In spite of the humor, Seth Jane was very emphatic and serious in giving this material. The pace was fast. Pause at 11 o'clock.
Many of the men involved did lead double lives then, known in their villages by one name and in their brotherhoods by another. In some cases, their more mundane identities were never divulged, but to a few. Later, when the Christians were being persecuted, there were many safeguards taken, particularly by those who believed they had a responsibility to live long enough to see the new creed find fertile ground. Often Paul or Saul seemed to be where he was not, for example. Word would be sent out that he would travel to such and such a location, and stories planted there of his arrival, while instead he journeyed to an entirely different place. Now, you may take a break or end the session as you prefer.
We'll take the break, thank you. 11:05. Jane's pace had been fast enough through the delivery. Boy, he sure has energy, she said when she came out of trance. I felt like I was going right through the wall. Resume in a bantering manner at 11:15.
Now, I will not keep you from your beauty sleep.
Thanks, I need it. No, I don't. I'm beautiful enough.
I suppose you are putting this into the session for the use of future historians.
No, I'm not, though obviously I kept writing out of habit.
You should be getting some more reincarnational material on your own.
I feel that it's available now.
It is easily available. It will also open up greater activity in out-of-body experiences.
Well, that should be interesting.
I will let you all go.
To Sue.
I am glad you attended the session.
Sue, so am I.
You should be ready for some more experiences in probabilities. I must save my voice because we have a class session tomorrow night.
Humorously to me.
You do want to be able to hear me over there, don't you?
Sure, I usually do. Our apartment is divided by a long hall. When ESP class is held in the living room, I'm usually typing material in one of the rooms on the other side of the corridor. Sometimes I can hear Seth through the two closed doors. To Sue.
Again, I am glad you came, and a fond good night to you two.
Sue, thank you. Good night, Seth. Thank you very much. 11:20 p.m. Seth's reference to reincarnational material of my own concerned the reincarnational dramas that Jane, Sue, myself, and a few others have undertaken on our own, usually at our Friday night gatherings. This is a relatively new activity for us. It's been both surprising and very rewarding, and is an outgrowth of experiments Seth initiated in ESP class. Session 593, August 30th, 1971, 9:06 p.m., Monday. The regularly scheduled session for Wednesday, August 25th, was not held. This material came after the second break in this session. First, we received several pages about a very interesting development in Jane's psychic faculties, her growing ability to perceive a beneficial helper, as she has taken to calling it. There is much to be learned here. Earlier in the week, Jane received word that her editor wanted an introduction from her for Seth's book, and an appendix. She wondered if the 592nd session would be suitable, and I told her that I thought Seth had planned it that way. She was surprised, then agreed. We decided to leave it entirely up to Seth to produce whatever material he wanted for the appendix. Jane's pace, as she continued this session at 10:30, was quite fast, animated, and emphatic.
Now, for our appendix. The great religions of the world all had their births near the major coordination points.
See Chapter 5.
In such localities, changes are apt to appear rapidly, for ideas and emotions are propelled into physical actuality with great vigor. Ideas sweep like fire among the people. The psychic atmosphere is fertile. Creativity springs forth easily, and so such locations are not necessarily peaceful, although they would be the best ground in which peace could grow. Any ideas for good or bad become materialized with such strength, however, that the contradictory feelings of mankind are more apparent near coordination points. There are effects, not as yet ascertained by your scientists, that appear in such areas, effects that were known, however, at the time of Atlantis, and also utilized by the Lumanians. In a strange manner, space puckers to an unobservable degree, as far as your instruments are concerned, near these coordination points. Some of my readers may be familiar with black and white holes in space that your scientists have recently discovered.
Some theoretical physicists have postulated recently that when the nuclear fires of very massive stars are finally extinguished, their enormous gravity causes them to collapse so completely that they literally squeeze themselves out of existence. A black hole is thus left in space, and surrounding matter can disappear into this. It's been further suggested that this vanishing matter can show up elsewhere, either in our universe or others, through white holes. There would be a flow of matter in our universe and also between universes, keeping things in balance.
These points have somewhat the same qualities. The electromagnetic aspects of thoughts and emotions, the animations, are drawn through points that can compare to miniature black holes. Here, their energy momentarily disappears from your system, is immeasurably accelerated, however, and returned through what you might call a miniature white hole, concentrated now, and highly directed back into your system of reality. This is only an analogy, but for working purposes it is a fair enough one. There is, again, a wrinkling effect about these points, though not as yet observable to you, where space itself, it seems, yearns to disappear inside the first point. There are other distortions in physical laws. A few of these have been observed, but ignored as pertinent signs.
With gestures, eyes wide open.
The activities of atoms and molecules quicken as they approach these points, but the distance between the atoms and molecules remains the same. That is important.
Pause at 10:45.
These coordination points also serve to give your system additional sources of energy. The law of entropy does not apply, therefore. The coordination points are actually, then, sources of additional energy. They only open, however, when concentrations of energy build up within your system. I would like to make the idea clearer. A physical vehicle, a spaceship, for example, could never survive that kind of exit and re-entry from your system.
Long pause at 10:50. Jane's delivery had been very animated. A note. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that while the total energy in a closed system such as our universe remains constant, the amount of energy available for useful work is constantly decreasing. A mathematical factor that measures the unavailable energy is called entropy. Seth has insisted from the very beginning of our sessions that the law of entropy doesn't apply and that there are no closed systems.
In Atlantis, there were those who utilized this knowledge, accelerating certain thoughts through concentration, emphasizing certain feelings so as to send them through these coordination points. Great stability was therefore achieved as far as roads, buildings, and the like were concerned. Such projects were carried out with great consideration for their position between various coordination points. This pocketing of space effect can be perceived in certain trance states.
Can Rupert do this? I didn't think Seth heard me. There was a burst of traffic noise through our open living room window just as I asked the question. The answer came easily, though.
This can be compared almost to a wadding up of air. Now, sit quietly with your eyes closed and try to ascertain the directional proximity of main or subordinate coordination points. Here are some aids to help you. With the intent in mind, you will find your inner vision inclining toward a particular direction of the room, and even your thoughts will seem to follow in the same direction. An imaginary line will help you properly identify the place in any given location closest to any given coordination point. Imagine a line drawn from the point of your inner vision, coming from the inner eye you seem to be using outward. Let it be joined by an imaginary line from the top of your skull, following the same direction in which your thoughts seem to flow. You have an imaginary line, then, in this case, from here and here. There is an angle, and then both lines form together. They will point unerringly to the direction closest to a coordination point.
To illustrate this as she spoke for Seth, Jane touched her eyes with one hand and the top of her head with the other. She extended her hands from these points until they met at arm's length, somewhat off to her right. I sat roughly south of Jane as she faced me, so this meant she indicated the western corner of our living room.
The subordinate points permeate space. Rupert will be able to tell you, for example, the nearest point in this room. Sometimes the angle will be longer, but the two lines will point in the right direction. Energy is, therefore, most effective in those areas.
Long pause.
Now, you may take a break or end the session as you prefer.
We'll take a break. 11:02. Jane was quiet after coming out of a deep trance. I wondered aloud where the nearest coordination point was. This brought forth a torrent of information from her. She'd forgotten it until my remark reminded her of what had happened. Jane said that while speaking for Seth, she knew the two lines she was indicating met in the west by south corner of our room. She walked over to the spot most positively. It was just inside the wall, between two of our bay windows, and in back of an old-fashioned exposed steam pipe. Unfortunately, it was crowded between a heater and bookcase, and wasn't a spot we could put into easy use. Walking about the room, Jane said she felt her thoughts lean in just that direction. Now that she knew where the coordination point was, it seemed incredible to her that she hadn't always known its location. She couldn't possibly lean mentally in any other direction, she said. She turned her back to the spot and gleefully announced that she felt the lines go out to it from the back of her head. Resume at 11:10.
Now, using this analogy of the white hole and the black hole, to make this clearer, the white hole is within the black hole. Do you follow me?
Yes.
Electromagnetic properties are drawn into the black hole and accelerated beyond imagination. The acceleration and the activities within the black hole draw unbelievable proportions.
I checked this word with Seth.
Of additional energy from other systems. This greater acceleration changes the very nature of the units involved. In the meantime, the characteristics of the black hole itself are changed by this activity. A black hole is a white hole turned inside out, in other words. The electromagnetic matter may reemerge through the same hole or point, which is now a white hole. The reemergence, however, again alters its characteristics. It becomes hungry once more, and again a black hole. The same sort of activity goes on in all systems. The holes, therefore, or coordination points, are actually great accelerators that re-energize energy itself. We will end this material for this evening.
An abrupt ending, then, after a long pause, but Seth returned.
Put a note after the material on coordination points, indicating the appendix. This is not our book. This is the appendix to our book.
Okay.
My heartiest good wishes to you, and a fond good evening.
Thank you very much, Seth.
And when you find time for the recorder, I will find time for you.
All right. Good night now. 11:21 p.m. After the session, Jane tried Seth's method for finding coordination points once more. Again, she found herself pointing to the west by south corner of the room. I got a whole bunch of stuff that time, she said, meaning that she received some extra information after trance. Those lines form triangular or flue shapes that contain energy. That's why psychics talk about pyramid forms. Those lines keep the energy concentrated. Sure, that's why I get the triangle effect with Seth 2. Only when I'm in a Seth 2 trance, the coordination point is in a different direction. It goes up from the top of my head, way out of the room and the house into a different reality. Jane then thought of having the members of her ESP class try Seth's method. She wanted to see if they could locate the same spot that she had. Session 594, September 13th, 1971, 9:40 p.m., Monday. Only one session was held last week, and that was a long overdue promised one for friends. Sue Watkins witnessed tonight's session. She intended to leave before session time, but Jane invited her to stay at 8:50. Sue's unexpected presence is a fine example of how spontaneous events can influence a session in a very creative way, as Sue's notes, quoted later, will show. As usual, Jane had no idea of what tonight's session would include. "Stuff for the appendix, I hope," she said. She was in an excellent mood, even a hilarious one. This quality also turned up in the session, in Seth's funny, over-elaborate requests for me to use just the right punctuation and paragraphing. We were late getting started because of my own work in the studio. Talking and laughing, Jane and Sue waited for me to join them in the living room with my notebook. Jane's delivery was quite brisk, with an occasional short pause.
Now, I bid you good evening, and our friend.
Sue.
I would have some interesting comments to make regarding the relationships between you, but we must be up and about with our appendix, and so we will continue that. The other information will come in its own time. Objects are the symbols. You usually think of them simply as realities. You think of thoughts, images, and dreams sometimes as being symbolic of other things, but the truth is that physical objects are themselves symbols. They are the exterior symbols that stand for inner experience. There are, therefore, mass physical symbols upon which you all agree, as well as private personal symbols. The whole nature and structure of physical life as you know it is a symbolic statement made by groups of entities who choose to work with physical symbolism. So the body is a symbol for what you are, or what you think you are, and these may be two different things indeed.
Seth actually made an elaborately humorous request for the dash in the last sentence. Jane, her eyes very dark, leaned far forward over our coffee table and spoke to me in a soft voice.
Any physical ailment is symbolic of an inner reality or statement. Your entire life is a statement in physical terms, written upon time as you understand it. New paragraph. Once you understand the symbolic nature of physical reality, then you will no longer feel entrapped by it. You have formed the symbols, and therefore you can change them. You must learn, of course, what the various symbols mean in your own life and how to translate their meaning. To do so, you must first of all remind yourself frequently that the physical condition is symbolic, not a permanent condition. Then you must look within yourself for the inner actuality represented by the symbol. This same process can be followed regardless of the nature of the problem or of your challenge.
9:50.
Your intimate physical environment is, therefore, a symbolic statement of an inner situation. The inner situation is a fluid one, for you are always in a state of becoming. Left alone, you will automatically translate the freely moving, spontaneous inner events into physical reality, therefore altering your environment and changing the symbols. If, however, you imagine that the environment or physical condition is the reality, then you can feel trapped by it and spend your efforts fighting a paper dragon. The environment is always altered from the inside. There is instant feedback between the interior and exterior conditions, but the mobility, the necessity, and the method of changing the physical environment will always come from within. New paragraph.
Again, a very quiet, smiling, and polite request. I'm way ahead of you this time, Seth.
Many of the ideas given in this book can be used most advantageously to solve personal problems. If these concepts are understood, then the individual should realize the freedom he has to operate purposefully within the structure of physical life. Many of you are so used to looking outward and accepting the physical world as the criterion for reality that it has not occurred to you to look within. The entire framework of your existence, therefore, is constantly flowing from within outward and being projected into those physical symbols that you mistake then for reality.
To Sue, who sat beside me on the couch.
I am pretty good on details, too. New paragraph.
Seth burst out with loud and emphatic humor this time because of the work Jane and I have done in recent weeks as we proofread this book, checking all my notes that are included and so forth.
The interior drama, however, is always the important one. The story of your life is written by you, by each reader of this book. You are the author. There is no reason, therefore, for you to view the drama and feel trapped by it. The power to change your own condition is your own. You have only to exercise it. To some other types of consciousness, your physical reality is clearly understood in its symbolic form. Objects, as symbols, help construct the very framework of your existence. They, the objects, can then be manipulated quite freely. You may take your break.
Thank you. 10 o'clock. Jane's pace had been fairly good. Her eyes had been closed often, however, which is rather unusual. The first thing she wanted to know when she came out of trance was if the session contained new material. I had to tell her I didn't know. I'd been too busy writing. Nor could I keep all of Seth's book in mind, even though I was working with the manuscript just now. But then, Jane said, neither could she, and she had just finished reading the whole thing over. A note. Jane was halfway through the final draft of her introduction to Seth's book when this session was held. Sue said the material had a great deal of meaning for her, and that she now realized that it hadn't been an accident that she'd dropped in this evening. She had much more to say here, especially concerning her impressions of Jane, Seth, and the great energy involved in these sessions. It developed that Sue had begun to experience and formulate some impressions both before and during the session. Sue's comments were so very good that I asked her to write them down. She wrote them during the rest of the break, then added to them occasionally through the rest of the session. They are presented here in slightly abridged form. As I sat here before the session, Sue wrote, I got an impression of Seth that I'd never had before. It was as though Jane, Rob, and I were traveling at a certain familiar speed while we were talking, although this has nothing to do with motion. When Seth came around, just before the session, it seemed that something within Jane began to crank up, to whirl or accelerate faster and faster, until a certain incredibly other speed was reached, a part of Jane's consciousness that is called Seth. At that point, the speed was right, and things clicked somehow. Jane took off her glasses, as she always does. I could almost hear this action. Then, the Seth personality began to communicate. The Seth 2 experience would be an even greater acceleration of this speed, reached at the point of the pyramid effect Jane describes. Even while I told Jane about this during break, I could feel this acceleration begin again, as Jane's consciousness prepared to continue the communication. It was almost an inside-out process of going into trance, and as I watched Seth a few minutes later, it seemed that Jane's consciousness was rushing past her open eyes, beyond my comprehension of what speed is. I now must wonder how the communication ever gets back down to words. I don't mean to say by this that I think Seth and Jane are the same personality. Rather, my feeling is that this acceleration connects portions of the same consciousness that are normally so diverse as to be two separate personalities for all practical purposes. I can recognize the same feeling of acceleration when I'm writing well myself, or even talking enthusiastically. But the feeling of vast, incomprehensible speed behind Seth's eyes goes way beyond that. I could sense the notion of speeds very clearly, both in Jane and Seth, and I felt partly carried along by them. When Jane came out of trance, it was, again, an almost audible experience for me, a feeling of slowing down from a high, airy whine to our normal sound or speed. There was a great sense of change. It was as though part of this acceleration was connected with a dimension where sound was more than a hearing thing. It's a terrific, vital feeling. I could feel it starting up toward the end of each break. Jane resumed at 10:25 at a slower pace.
Now, our friend Sue's observations came very close to an excellent description of Rupert's subjective feelings, as he told you during break. I refer readers to Rupert's introduction, in which he compares his own creative experiences as a writer to those he feels in our sessions. There are several points he did not understand, and so here I would like to clear them.
With a pause.
New paragraph. In our own sessions, he is not aware consciously of the creative work that is being done, precisely because he has gone out of the range that the conscious mind can follow. He has projected a portion of himself into an entirely different kind of subjective reality, a different dimension of activity entirely. Referring to his introduction again, he remarks that he misses the excitement of the chase encountered in his own creative work. Here, you see, the acceleration is so rapid and intense that he is not consciously able to follow it. The unconscious, so-called, has little to do with this phenomenon. It is, however, related strongly to qualities inherent within each consciousness. Such ability is rarely used to full advantage. Connections are made so rapidly that the physical brain is not aware of them.
Pause, one of many, at 10:30.
Rupert has indeed always possessed this ability to a strong degree. For various reasons, reincarnationally speaking, he allowed himself to remain ignorant of the ways in which the ability could be used for the early portion of his life. During sessions, however, all the characteristics of the inner being are accelerated, the knowing, intuitional, creative abilities working at a rate far beyond what you would call the norm. This is a dimension of existence native to consciousness, however, when it is not physically oriented. Rupert can and will learn to explore this dimension even further. Only his lack of confidence in the past held him back. The acceleration propels him into a state in which he can operate quite well, while going beyond all those normal psychological realities that he would personally call his own.
Pause.
In such a state, he literally uses incredible power in terms of energy now, and the volume of the voice in many cases is an attempt to help him use some of this and discharge it while he learns how to use it and until he is taught other purposes to which it can be put. The volume, of course, can also be used as an excellent demonstration of the vitality with which he is in touch. Now you can take a break. Finish your notes.
Okay.
And I will give Super Jane a rest.
Pause, pointing to Sue.
This one here is waiting for him to come back so she can feel the difference.
10:37. Sue was on the edge of the couch, watching Jane closely as she came out of a deep trance. Once again, she talked about the change in Jane's speeds. A sound goes along with those speeds that I can't describe, Sue said. It's like being in a dimension where music is the reality, where sound is more than just hearing things. Then, when you leave it, Sue whistled, imitating the Doppler effect of a train whistle receding into the distance. When Sue and Jane questioned me about this, I had to tell them that I didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. But then I seldom do during sessions. Concentrating on writing helps close out other effects also. I am always writing, it seems, just as I wrote through most of this break period. Again, Sue watched Jane expectantly as we waited for Seth to return. "Wow, the acceleration's terrific," Sue exclaimed. And just before going back into trance, Jane told us she felt the chair vibrating beneath her. Resume, with pauses, at 10:57.
Now, many of the experiences that Rupert has during our sessions he cannot recall afterward. As physical objects are symbols existing as realities within certain frequencies, so there are other realities, of course, at different frequencies. But here, objects are not the main symbols. Experience within such a dimension is extremely difficult to translate when Rupert is back within the physical system. On my part, there are also adjustments that must be made. I step down several levels, for example, so that contact can be made. I then attempt what is indeed a creative endeavor in which Rupert participates, the act of translating such inner data into physical terms, bringing into your reality those clues that I can bring you of these other realities of which you are part.
Pause at 11 o'clock. In a quietly amused manner now, Seth was giving frequent instructions regarding punctuation, etc. Jane's eyes were closed often.
Seen or viewed from my natural perspective, your objects do not exist. Your inner reality does, of course. Now, Rupert's system physically undergoes some changes, although these are largely native to his constitution. He saw to that before his life began. He uses nervous connections in a way that is unusual and to his purpose. His pulse rate is normal. The acceleration begins, however, on a physical level with the use of hormones and chemicals and then leaps from there. Both halves of the brain spark, and from those connections, speaking physically now, the acceleration is initiated and its effects on the body are cut off. Many cases of missing persons can be explained somewhat in the same manner, when the acceleration was strong enough, unexpected enough, to sweep the entire personality out of your system. Now, for our friend's sake, I am speeding up the acceleration to see if she can perceive it. This often takes place during the dream state, and when it seems to you that you have briefly entered an astonishing new dimension. The dream state itself involves such an acceleration.
As I wrote, I took a quick look at Sue beside me. She sat very quietly, watching Jane. Jane's eyes were open now, her pace faster, her voice somewhat louder.
To some extent or another, each artistic creation, though to a lesser degree, involves the same principle. Now, I cannot keep the additional acceleration up, or the voice will go so quickly that our friend cannot keep to his notes.
Jane's voice abruptly grew much louder with the last sentence, an effect Sue and I have witnessed often. This volume was far from her potential when speaking for Seth, however. On some occasions, her voice has been so loud that my ears rang. I've heard Jane keep up very strong voice effects with such ringing peaks for an incredible several hours, and without signs of strain afterward.
Now, do not take notes.
His loud and rapid voice soon quieting, Seth explained to me that he would give a fine demonstration of an acceleration in a session in which we used our recorder. Sue could sit in on it, and hopefully I would experience the acceleration as clearly as she does. This interlude ended in a break at 11:10. When Jane came out of trance, Sue was again drastically aware of the drop in Jane's speed. She also had some visual effects that were hard to describe. In an effort to pin these down, she began adding to her own notes, and these are quoted at the end of the session. Sometimes, in ESP class, I would take the whole class with me on a real acceleration adventure if they could go, Jane said. She used the contrasting example of trees in a forest, comparing their passive state to the feeling of acceleration, of being able to go right through the wall that she sometimes gets. There was more here that I didn't get down. Resume at 11:20.
Now, I am going to end the session shortly. It was, of course, no coincidence that our friend came here this evening. Besides giving you necessary information for the appendix, some of the information given on objects and symbolism definitely applied to Sue.
To me.
I feel sorry for you.
Why?
Because you have been writing so steadily.
I'm okay.
There is one point I can add here in connection with the religious drama of Christ and the disciples. As Rupert said after reading the body of the book, the interior drama is the real one. Christ became the crucified, Judas became the betrayer, though Christ was not crucified and Judas did not betray him. The reality, therefore, was in the myth. The reality was the myth. In such cases, the interior events will always predominate, regardless of the physical facts, which are only symbols for these events. Now, I bid you a fond good evening.
Good evening, Seth. It's been a pleasure. To Sue.
And I will let my friend Rupert slide back down.
Sue. All right. Good night. 11:25 p.m. Once out of trance, Jane had little to say. I'm just sitting here watching you two busy bees, she grinned, as Sue and I worked on our separate notes. Before break at 11:10, Sue wrote, when Seth told me that he was speeding up the acceleration to see if I could perceive it, I had the definite feeling of greater speed and a visual change in Jane's body. It seemed to become smaller, as though I were looking at it through the wrong end of binoculars. This was again connected with motion, as though the physical frequency was also changed, and Jane's body was rushing past me, even while staying in the same place. Then, when Jane came out of trance at last break, I felt as though a force had been released in front of me, so that if I wasn't careful, I could topple over. And the same thing now after the session. Session 595, September 20th, 1971, 9:01 p.m., Monday. The first part of the session was given over to a friend who needed help with a personal problem. She taped Seth's information, then left when break came at 9:45. I had 2 questions for our portion of the session, and we expected that Seth's answers would be included in the appendix of his book. The first question. According to Seth, he, Jane, and I lived in Denmark in the 1600s. I simply wanted clarification of the data on my lifespan as given in the notes at the end of the 541st session in Chapter 11. The second question. Did Seth intend to title Part 1 and Part 2 of his book as he had his chapters? Resume at 10:05.
Now.
Good evening, Seth.
Now I have to speak more slowly, you see. The information on the Denmark life in Chapter 11 is correct, except for a misinterpretation. That was one life divided into 2 separate periods. Literally, a life divided in terms of interests, concentration of abilities, and lifestyles. Aside from the information given in that chapter, there have been distortions in some past material concerning that life. These were not caused by Rupert's feeling about reincarnation. They were simply a result of correlating many details into the correct specific pattern. Some of the names given, for example, applied to friends rather than to yourselves. The overall picture, the validity of the existence carried through the distortions, however. I was a spice merchant. You were originally an artist, who turned rather dramatically into a landowner and against your youthful ways. Rupert was a dabbler in art as a young man also, and you resented this, grown fat and prosperous. You wanted him to go into more acceptable work, and you were ashamed of your own early wanderings as an itinerant artist. Here the division was set between the idea of owning property as opposed to being an artist. In this life, that has caused you considerable unease.
10:13. This is very true. And for whatever reasons, in this life I have insisted upon being an artist in spite of all obstacles. In the 223rd session for January 16, 1966, Seth said that my name in the Denmark life was Larns Devensdorf. My wife then was named Letty Kloos. My son, who is now Jane, was Groton. Seth, a prosperous merchant, traveler, and family friend, was named Brons Martens.
The general itinerary of my journeys, as given in that session by Rupert, was correct. There were some distortions in other portions of that session, however.
Long pause at 10:15.
The details that so concern you now are, of course, important, and yet in a larger way it is the deep emotional experience of your life that is later remembered. Basically, the names and dates are meaningless to the inner self. Therefore, in reincarnational data, the emotional values will come through more vividly and with much less distortion. You place upon names and dates an importance you presently find of critical import. You insist upon them to add to the validity of past life narratives. Yet these are precisely those things that are forgotten first, and that have least value psychologically.
1020.
Certain names will, therefore, spring into immediacy. You insist that the names be neatly placed, and yet often the inner self has great difficulty in this regard, for names simply do not matter. Persons and events of meaning, carrying strong emotional charges, will come through far clearer. Dates that are associated with emotional events will also be recalled. The past life is,
Smile.
like a crossword puzzle that must be put together, but at its center is the emotional reality from which the puzzle springs.
Seth smiled because of Jane's recently developed, rather strong interest in crossword puzzles. I enjoy them also. We've been speculating about the symbolic reasons behind our involvement.
Many such reincarnational narratives are liberally sprinkled with names and dates simply to satisfy those who insist upon them, because the emotional and psychological validity may not be accepted otherwise. This applies to any kind of reincarnational material, however it may be obtained. Now, if the life in question is a recent one in your terms, the details may be more readily recalled and far more precise. Even a life centuries ago may be perfect in detail, however, if it included, for example, battles or events of great import, where the dates themselves were impressed upon the personalities because of the occurrences at those times.
1029.
Any emotional experience that is highly charged will carry a barrage of details along with it, but usual dates and usual names have little meaning. They have little meaning in your own reality. Basically speaking, relationships are far more important, and these you do not forget. These lives exist simultaneously across the board, however. This you should not forget. The useless paraphernalia is not important to the various personalities, however, now or then. Do you follow me?
Yes.
The reincarnational structure is built along the same lines of existence that you know now. Some individuals are more intrigued by detail than others. A particular previous personality may be one who had a great love of detail, in which case you would discover the richness of it. The particular likes and dislikes of any given personality will also have much to do with the descriptions given of a particular reincarnational episode. It will do no good to ask deep questions concerning the history of the times of some personality who was impoverished, ignorant, and limited. He simply would not know the answers. The picture of any given life, therefore, usually comes through the experience of the personality who lived it.
Pause at 1035.
Again, those details will emerge that were important to him. In my particular case, I am so unfocused on my own reincarnational selves, and they have gone so far on their own, that I have little feeling of immediacy. Since we,
Seth, Jane, and I,
have been so involved, however, those relationships remain important, and in your terms, our present relationship was latent then. The Denmark life exists as much as this one does for you. You are simply focused within this picture of reality. Now you may take your break.
Thank you. 1037 to 1050.
Now, the reincarnational structure is a psychological one. It cannot be understood in any other terms. The distortions and interpretations that have built up about it are natural enough, considering what seems to be your practical experience with the nature of time. The reality, the validity, the immediacy of those lives do exist simultaneously with your present life. The distance between one life and another exists psychologically, and not in terms of years or centuries. The psychological distance, however, can be far more vast. There are certain lives, as there are certain events in this life, that you may not want to face or deal with. There may be great temperamental differences in some cases between your personality in one given life and another, so that your present self simply could not relate to the other's experience. You will be more strongly drawn to those past lives that somehow reinforce your own at this time. You realize that your early memories are sparse. Most of you remember little of the years spent as an infant and child. You make use of the knowledge gained then, and while it is part of you, you are not aware of it consciously, and so you are not consciously aware of other reincarnational existences.
In a whisper, humorously.
New paragraph. Earlier in this book, I mentioned alternate presents on several occasions, and reincarnational lives are indeed alternate presents. There is interaction between you and your reincarnational selves constantly. There is, as your friend Sue Watkins said, constant action across the board.
1101.
Those selves are not dead, in other words. Your understanding of this must be limited because you automatically think in terms of one life experience at a time and in linear patterns of development. In your terms, a reincarnational self can be aware of your environment and interact sometimes through your own relationships. Certain present happenings can indeed spark such interactions. In quite other terms, however, the reincarnated personality, while interacting with or through you, can still be having other kinds of experience at other levels.
Jane's delivery was quite animated and positive here, as though Seth wanted her gestures to underscore the material.
Because time is open-ended as you think of it, you can also affect what you would think of as past reincarnational selves, and at times react in and to their environment. You would usually do this in the dream state, but this is often accomplished just below the level of waking consciousness, and is blotted out by you as you go about your daily business.
1107.
Strong emotional associations can often trigger such responses.
Pause.
Reincarnation, as it is usually explained, in terms of one life before another, is a myth, but a myth enabling many to partially understand facts that they would otherwise dismiss, insisting as they do upon the concept of a continuity of time. Now, you may take a break or end the session.
We'll take the break, Seth. 1110. Jane had been way out, as she often puts it. She remembered only the first sentence or so of the material. All of her trances have been deep this evening. It takes her a bit longer to leave such a state. Her eyes roll up occasionally, etc. At break, I repeated my question about titles for parts 1 and 2 of Seth's book. Resume in the same manner at 1124.
Now, we do not need to name the two portions separately. I had thought of specifically having the first part deal with inner and outer immediate environments, and then to lead to the larger reality of the soul and its perception in the second part. This is what I did, but the material is so interwoven that I felt the given separation enough, and did not want to reinforce the idea of a division.
Smiling.
Now, I could go on for hours, but I suggest that you get your rest.
It will be appreciated, the rest, that is. And although I was getting weary, it was apparent that Seth could easily shift into a state where his energy would seem inexhaustible.
I bid you a most fond good evening.
I thought the personal material you gave for our witness tonight before first break was excellent.
It was indeed. It was tailor-made for her. Now, when the appendix is done and your work with this book is finished, I will give you as many sessions as you would like, within reason, for yourself, and use the recorder.
Okay, good night, Seth, and thank you. 11:27 p.m. That was funny, Jane said, after she rested for a few minutes. I was really out that last time, but it was for such a short time that I really felt the transitions from here to there and back. That word Sue used, acceleration, is a good one. See the 594th session. Session 596, September 27th, 1971, 9:24 p.m., Monday. Jane and I worked on proofreading Seth's book for an hour or so after supper, and then went for a walk. It was a warm and rainy fall evening, already dark and very pleasant. There was a scattering of wet fallen leaves about. By 8:30, we were back home. We sat in the living room with the lights off so that we could see outside easily. Jane had finished the introduction to Seth's book today. This, in turn, reminded her of her own manuscript, The Physical Universe as Idea Construction, which she discusses in the introduction. She had read it again today, and it still intrigues her. She said again that she'd like something with it on her own eventually. 9 o'clock passed almost unnoticed as we talked. I turned on a couple of lights when we finally got down to the business of holding a session. Jane wanted more material for the appendix of Seth's book. She said that the living room seemed different this evening, significant. But it was a nice difference, she added. She began speaking for Seth in a very quiet voice. Her pace was rather slow, her eyes closed often.
Good evening.
Good evening, Seth.
Now, the physical universe as idea construction, mentioned by Rupert in his introduction, did indeed represent our first formal contact, although Rupert was not aware of it at that time. The experience came within a framework that he could accept, that of highly accelerated inspiration. His consciousness left his body only after he was in the throes of what seemed to him to be inspiration of almost unbearable intensity. Had his habits instead led him, say, to regular prayer, then that framework could also have been used. In all such cases, several qualities are apparent: an ability to look inward, to concentrate deeply, to lose the sharp edges of the physically oriented self in contemplation, and an intense desire to learn. These must be coupled with the inner confidence that pertinent knowledge can be directly received. To those who believe that all answers are known, there is little need to search. Such information, such inspired writing, usually appears within frameworks of the personality that have already been set and formed. The context in which such knowledge appears will often vary, therefore. In some cases, the framework itself is used for a final time, with the initial inspired knowledge, the knowledge itself, escaping from the framework and growing out of the context that allowed for its birth.
Pause at 9:35, one of many. Jane's delivery was more vigorous by now, however.
Above all, individuals who receive such information in states of expanded consciousness are already those who feel deeply within themselves connections not only with the earth itself, but with deeper realities.